Welcome to On the Way Classroom with Tony Crisp. Each weekday, Monday through Friday, Dr. Crisp will teach the Bible from its historical, geographical, linguistic, and cultural context. Tune in daily to start your day right and to deepen your understanding of how to better walk the way and enjoy the journey. Now, here's your host, Dr. Tony Crisp.
Welcome to On the Way Classroom. I'm glad that you're here today because we are going to take another step through this intertestamental period. Now, in our last session together, we talked about how God was preparing the world for Jesus of Nazareth to come into the world and to have the world ready for him. The world stage was set for the Messiah to come when Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And during our last sessions, we have been talking about the synagogue system and how it was formed because it was so important for the preaching of the gospel and the spreading of the gospel around the world. After all, the Apostle Paul, who was the great missionary, and those who were with him were the great missionaries to carry the gospel from Jerusalem throughout the known world of the New Testament era. The Roman world, the Greco-Roman world of the New Testament era. And so the synagogue system was on the spear point because everywhere that the Apostle Paul and the other disciples went, the apostles of Jesus, they would go to the synagogue system. Paul said that the euangelion, the gospel, the good news of redemption, was to first be to the Jew. And that is in present tense. That still is today and for all time. And so they would have a preaching point where they could go in as Jews and participate in synagogue worship, and a rabbi like the Apostle Paul could go anywhere in the Greco-Roman world, and as the protege of Gamaliel the elder, he would have a platform in those synagogues to preach the gospel. All of that was due to the sovereignty of God working its way out in preparing the way for the Messiah through the destruction of the first temple and the scattering of the Jews around the world, especially in Mesopotamia. And then after the building of the second temple during the Persian period, the synagogue system did not go away. It was strengthened during the Persian period through people like Ezra and Nehemiah, especially Ezra, whom I believe is the one who designed what's called the Torah portion and all of the different concepts of reading of Torah throughout the week. That came from that Persian period, and all of that was important to get the world ready for Jesus. But the whole world did not speak one language until the Greek period, which I date from 333 years before Christ all the way down to 63, which I then start the Roman period with Pompey marching through the Levant. And so I want to help us today to understand just again the importance of the Greek language. And so not only was the Greek language important, but also the Greek philosophy. And when the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, an evangelist, a spreader of the good news, he talked about Hellenization. And it's hard to read the New Testament, especially the book of Acts, without coming across that term over and over and over again. Now, this Greek period was so important because, remember, to be Hellenized was to be one who spoke Greek, who had Greek culture, Greek customs, Greek thought and philosophy. It was a mindset. And this caused great trouble in the early church. We read about it in Acts chapter 6. Remember, we're talking about in the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son. And so all of these things had to be put in place. And so God used these so-called 400 silent years to get us ready for the Messiah, to get the world ready for the coming of Jesus of Nazareth. And so God's put out these preaching points in the synagogue. There was one world language. There was one world culture that was recognizable by all. And so the Jews that were scattered out during this period, they began to call the Beit Knesset, which is the word in Hebrew for the house of assembly, the synagogos, the synagogue. That's the way it's brought over into English. And that is a Greek word. Synagogue is a Greek word, and it means to gather together, to go up to a place together. And so these synagogues, in them, of course, Hebrew was read because that was the official language. But about 270 years or thereabouts, approximately, before the coming of Jesus, during the height of the Greek period, we began to understand something of how the kingdom was divided. You see, after Alexander died, he had 4 primary generals that divided up the Greek kingdom, the Greek empire. And 2 of them we're not going to deal so much with. That took what is modern-day Turkey, which was called Asia or Asia Minor during the Roman period, and what was Hellas or Macedonia and Greece today. That was in the European theater. But now we're going to talk about 2 of his generals. One was Seleucus, and his kingdom was called the Seleucid Kingdom. And it was primarily Babylon, Mesopotamia, what is Syria today, what would have been Iran, Persia today. It was a great swath of land, and Seleucus was a very powerful general. And then the other that I want us to center in on, out of the 4 generals that took over and divided up the kingdom, one is Seleucus and the other is Ptolemy, or Ptolemy. That is spelled Ptolemy, simply because we don't, in our language, use that P. It's like pneumonia. It's silent. Ptolemy was the general that took over what we would call North Africa. He took over what was Egypt and the countries near there, Libya and so forth. All of that was Ptolemaic dynasty. And these 2 generals are very important because they are to play a pivotal role in the formation of what we call the New Testament era. Seleucus, for instance, he was the head of the dynasty from which Antiochus IV came, who was also called Epiphanes. Now, the reason he is important is because Daniel prophesied of the events that he would participate in, that was to be only one fulfillment of a greater fulfillment that was to come in biblical prophecy from someone called the beast or the Antichrist. And that person is still to come on the scene. But the same kind of things that the Antichrist will do in the future, that great beast that is the personification of Satan himself, was first in type and in reality fulfilled in Antiochus IV or Antiochus Epiphanes. Why? Because he ruled that Seleucid kingdom to the north of what is Israel ancient and modern. And he was so wicked that he forbid the reading of Torah, and I explained that in an earlier time that the Haftarah came into existence during that time. That is the reading of the prophets and any writings that would be appropriate that would point back to Torah when Torah was forbidden. He also forbid the act of circumcision. Well, you can imagine what that did, because circumcision and the reading of Torah were 2 of the central parts of Judaism. And so this brought about the Maccabean revolt. Now, all of this is important because not just the feast of dedication or rededication, the word in Hebrew is Hanukkah, And we still see the Jews and many in the West observing Hanukkah today. All of that came out of this Greek period. And it was so important because it was during this period that so much of the New Testament background and culture was formed. The priesthood, as it was during the days of Jesus, came about during this period. And the political aspects of it came about during this period. All of this was during that Greek period. But the language came to the forefront for the Jewish people because the other general, beside the one that we call Seleucus, was Ptolemy. Ptolemy had all of Egypt, and the city of Alexandria became the center of world learning. The largest library in the world was there. Why? Because they had papyri, which was everywhere in that diluvian fan of the Nile River, and it ran into the Mediterranean there. And so Alexandria was a cultural center, and Ptolemy wanted what we call the Old Testament translated into the Greek language. And so it is said that he brought in 70 scribes and a priest and said, I want you to translate the Hebrew Old Testament, the Hebrew Tanakh, the Law, the Prophets, and the Writings, into the Greek language, Koine or Common Greek. And so that is what they did. In a short period of time, 70 scholars came back together and they had a translation of the Hebrew Scriptures into Common Greek where the people could read it. And so the Greek leadership could read it. And that 70 scholar translation was called the Septuagint, which is the root word for 70. And so that Septuagint was quoted in the New Testament. And it was the version, if you will, the translation that the common people read. And so this was very, very important because you had the preaching of the gospel and a Greek translation for everyone to see. And again, this is very important. Now, it's important to us in English. Why? Because the Septuagint had a different order and arrangement of books than the Hebrew divisions, which Jesus talked about in Luke chapter 24 and verse 44, when he talked about the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, which was the first book of the writings. Now, I know this is somewhat technical, but it's very important because our English versions, that is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and then Joshua, Judges, Ruth, so forth, all of the order of our Bibles today comes from the Septuagint translation, not from the Hebrew Bible, but from the Greek Bible. And so it not only affected the world of the Greeks, but it affects our world today because the Old Testament was translated into Greek, and from that Greek we get the Latin, and from the Latin they took the same order of books, and so we have our English divisions today and our English order and order of the books from that Greek period. That is how important the Greek period was for the formation of the world in which the gospel would go into and that the Son of God would be born into. And so these are just more evidences of how important that time was. And so remember, we're talking about in the fullness of time when God was getting the world ready. So you had the synagogue system, you had the Greek language, the Greek culture, the Greek philosophy. And in our next session together, we're going to look at the final piece of this puzzle with Rome and its conquering of the Greek world.
Thanks for listening to On the Way Classroom with Dr. Tony Crisp. Tune in each weekday for more information on how to read, study, and understand the Bible. If you have questions, please write to questions@tonycrisp.org. That's questions@tonycrisp.org. questions at tonycrisp.org. Thanks for listening and have a blessed day on the way.